He thought he was only there to fix the furnace. His neighbor's daughter had called him that morning, apologetic and rushed, explaining that the old shelter on Rideau Road had a heating unit acting up, and that the regular handyman was 2 hours out on another job. Terrence Blythe said yes before she finished the sentence, because saying yes to small useful things was the only way he had learned to fill a Tuesday in January. He was not supposed to stay. He was absolutely not supposed to come home with 2 dogs, cold pressed hard against the windows of the Carleton Place animal shelter. When Terrence pulled into the lot, his breath already clouding in the cab of his truck before he had the door open, he was 61 years old, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from something that did not apologize easily. He had spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL before a knee injury pulled him sideways into a long career in military logistics, then into the particular silence of early retirement on 40 acres outside town. His hands were still steady and his back still straight, though the left knee sent him weather reports no meteorologist could match. The shelter smelled the way all shelters smelled: antiseptic and animal warmth, and the particular kind of hope that survives under fluorescent lights. A young woman at the front desk directed him toward the utility room at the back without looking up from her paperwork, and Terrence moved through the hallway with his toolbox and his eyes forward, and absolutely no intention of stopping. Then he heard it. Not a bark, not a whimper, just the soft, deliberate click of claws on concrete, and then a small weight pressing against the wire of a kennel gate as he passed. He looked down. A dog pressed his muzzle against the gate, not frantically, not begging, just looking up at Terrence the way a person looks at someone they recognize from a long time ago. The dog was a border collie mix, mostly black with a white chest and one white sock on his front left paw, probably 8 or 9 weeks old, with ears still deciding whether to stand or fold. His eyes were mismatched, one pale blue, one dark brown, and both of them were fixed on Terrence with an attention that felt almost uncomfortable. The card on the kennel read Pip in someone's hurried handwriting, then below it, found near Highway 7. Littermate also available. Both must go together or separately after Friday. Terrence looked at the card. He looked at the dog. He kept walking. In the kennel, 3 doors down, behind a water bowl tipped sideways against the floor, a second puppy sat alone in the far corner. This one was smaller, the same border collie mix, white and black with a dark saddle across the shoulders, but the white on her face carried a pale brown wash around the eyes, like shadows under them. "Her name card," said Nell. She did not come to the gate. She did not press her nose toward him. She sat with her back straight and her eyes level, watching the hallway the way a soldier watches a perimeter. Not with fear, exactly, but with the practiced patience of something that had learned not to expect kindness, and was therefore never surprised when it did not arrive. Terrence's chest did something he did not authorize. He fixed the furnace in 22 minutes. A faulty igniter switch, nothing complicated. He filled out the maintenance sheet at the front desk, accepted a cup of coffee he had not asked for, and stood in the lobby long enough to drink half of it before he found himself walking back down the hallway, with a reason he did not examine too carefully. The shelter manager, a red-haired woman named June Alcott, found him standing in front of Nell's kennel with an empty coffee cup in his hand. June was somewhere in her mid-40s, practical and direct, with the look of someone who had heard every excuse a person could offer for not adopting an animal and had stopped being moved by most of them. She told him they had come in 4 days ago. Someone had seen them under a highway overpass during the cold snap, probably dumped, probably together since birth. Pip had adjusted within hours, ate, slept, greeted every volunteer like they were family he had simply lost track of. Nell had not eaten on her own until the 2nd day, and only then because a volunteer had sat beside her kennel for an hour without speaking before the dog finally crept forward and took 3 bites. "She's not unfriendly," June said. "She's careful. There's a difference." Terrence looked at the dog in the corner, who was still watching him with those steady, shadow-rimmed eyes. "What happens Friday?" he said. June's face did not change, but her voice dropped a register. "We're at capacity. If no placement comes through, they'll have to be separated. Pip already has 2 families interested. Nell doesn't have anyone. The hallway felt narrower than it had 20 minutes ago. He drove home with 2 dogs in the back seat of his truck. Pip rode with his front paws on the center console and his ears back in the wind from the cracked window, mouth open, eyes bright, thrilled by every passing telephone pole, as though each one were a personal achievement. Nell sat behind Terrence's seat with her back straight, and her eyes on the road ahead as if she were navigating. The farmhouse on Concession Road 9 had been built in 1948, and Terrence had bought it 7 years ago for reasons he had explained to no one, including himself. It was a 2-story white clapboard with a long covered porch, a red barn that housed firewood and 2 decades of accumulated tools, and 40 acres of mixed field and maple bush that went quiet in a way the city had never managed. He had renovated most of it himself, 1 room at a time, which was useful because it gave his hands something to do in the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning when the house felt largest. His late wife, Caroline, had never seen it. She had died 2 years before he found it. A brain aneurysm on an ordinary Wednesday, the kind of event that carries no warning and offers no negotiation. She had been 54 years old. She had been the person who laughed at his jokes before he finished them, and who kept a jar of dried lavender on every windowsill, and who had once, memorably, convinced him to adopt a 1-eared tomcat named Biscuit, who lived for 14 years, and was, objectively, the worst-tempered animal Terrence had ever met, and also somehow the best. Biscuit had been gone for 2 years. The windowsills had no lavender. The house was orderly and clean and very, very quiet. Pip hit the kitchen floor and immediately declared war on a dish towel hanging from the oven handle. He seized one end in his teeth and pulled with his entire body weight, skidding backward across the pine boards, growling like something twice his size until the towel came free and he fell on his hindquarters and looked surprised and then deeply proud. Terrence watched him. "That was mine," he said. Pip wagged with his whole back half. Nell stood near the door. She did not follow her brother into the kitchen. She moved along the wall instead, slow and deliberate, nose working at the baseboard, the corner of the wood stove, the leg of the kitchen table. She found a position where she could see the front door, the hallway, and Terrence at once. Then she sat. Just sat. With that same careful, level attention she had worn at the shelter, as though she were waiting to find out whether this place was worth trusting yet. Terrence had seen men sit like that, after deployment, in waiting rooms, in the passenger seat of vehicles they were not driving. That particular alertness that looked like calm, but was actually every nerve paying attention at once. He did not push her. He filled 2 bowls with water, set out food, and lowered himself to the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets and his long legs stretched out and his hands loose in his lap where she could see them. Pip immediately climbed onto his left boot and began chewing the lace with extraordinary concentration. Terrence let him. After a long while, Nell moved. She crossed the kitchen in small, deliberate steps, stopped a foot from the food bowl, checked Terrence's face, then looked at Pip, who had abandoned the bootlace and was now eating with his face fully inside the bowl. Something seemed to settle in her. She lowered her head and ate. 4 bites, then she stopped and looked up again, then 4 more. Terrence looked at the ceiling. He did not want to make a big thing of it. He understood instinctively that acknowledgement could feel like pressure. He looked at the window instead, at the January dark pressing against the glass, and pretended not to notice the small miracle happening 3 feet away. His neighbor Helen Marsh called that evening. Helen was 68, a retired schoolteacher from Perth who drove a 20-year-old Volvo and brought him baked goods at intervals he had come to recognize as concern disguised as casserole. She had known Caroline. She had, in the quiet, persistent way of certain good women, refused to let Terrence disappear entirely into his own silence. "June Alcott called me," Helen said. "She said you came in to fix the furnace." "I did, and somehow you left with 2 dogs. The math is more complicated than it looks." Helen made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Terrence. Helen." A pause. He could hear her smiling through it. "Caroline would have done the same thing," she said. "Faster, probably." He did not answer that. But after he hung up, he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Pip attempt to drag his boot, still attached to his foot, across the floor, and felt something that was almost a smile move through him, like something long frozen beginning to melt at one edge. Nell watched from her corner. When Terrence looked at her, she looked back. She did not look away. Several weeks passed, and the farmhouse on Concession Road 9 slowly stopped holding its breath. Pip grew in all directions at once, broader, louder, faster, more certain that every object in the house had been placed there for his personal investigation. He had developed a philosophy about shoes that Terrence found both infuriating and impossible to fully discourage, because the philosophy was delivered with such complete sincerity. He greeted every morning as though the previous one had been the best of his life, and this one would somehow be better. He had, on 2 separate occasions, fallen into the recycling bin while inspecting its contents, and both times emerged looking vindicated. Nell grew differently. Her coat filled out along her shoulders, the dark saddle deepening. Her movements became more assured without ever becoming careless. She still watched rooms before she entered them. She still chose corners where she could monitor 2 exits at once, but the quality of her watching had changed. It was less like bracing for something, and more like simply paying attention. The way a good person in a new place pays attention because they are genuinely interested in what they find. Something between her and Terrence had started to take shape in the evenings. Not Pip's uncomplicated love, which arrived daily like a bill he had never asked for, and was somehow always glad to pay. This was slower, more considered. Some nights Terrence would be sitting in the old wooden chair by the wood stove, reading or not reading, and Nell would walk across the room and stop a foot from his knee. She would pretend to examine the rug. She would sometimes turn away, but every time she came a little further before turning, like a tide testing how far it was allowed to go. Terrence never called her to him. He understood the ethics of it. You did not summon a creature still learning whether it was safe to come. The evening it all shifted was in February, during a cold that arrived without announcement, and pressed the temperature down to -30 with the wind. Pip had exhausted himself comprehensively, chasing his own reflection in the oven door, investigating the basement stairs and thinking better of it, falling asleep mid-wrestle with a rubber duck he had claimed as a trophy, and lay upside down near the stove radiating heat and contentment. Terrence sat with his coffee going cold and his mind going somewhere. He usually managed to redirect it before it got there. It was the kind of night that found the cracks. 11 years of deployments had given him a particular collection of things he did not look at directly. Most of them he had filed away with the discipline of someone who understood that function required compartmentalization, but Caroline's death had broken something in the filing system. Grief did not respect training. It showed up at 3 in the morning in a room that still held the shape of another person's life and reminded him that discipline was not the same as peace. He had, in the back bedroom, 2 boxes he had not opened since moving in. Caroline's handwriting was on both of them. Inside one was a collection of things she had kept from his deployments, letters he had written her from places he could not name, a photograph from their wedding that she had carried in her wallet for 30 years, a folded paper where she had written, in her small careful script, the things she was grateful for, dated the week before she died. He knew what was in them because he had packed them himself. He had not looked at them since. He heard the sound before he consciously registered it. The soft press of paws on the wood floor, moving down the hallway, stopping. Nell was sitting in front of the closed bedroom door, not whining, not scratching, just sitting there with her back straight and her shadow-rimmed eyes fixed on the door, patient as water wearing stone. Terrence stood in the hallway and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "That's not for you," he said. His voice came out quiet. Nell looked at him, then back at the door. Pip snored from the living room, a ridiculous soft sound that should have broken the moment, but instead only made the silence in the hallway more specific. Terrence stood there for a long time. Then he opened the door. The room smelled of cardboard and old wood, and a faint trace of something floral he could not name anymore, though he had once known exactly what it was. Lavender. He had not let himself think the word in years. He crossed to the boxes on the shelf without turning on the overhead light, using only what came through the hallway behind him, and he stood with one hand on the cardboard flap of the nearest one and felt how completely his body did not want to do this. Nell walked in behind him. She did not explore. She came to his left side and sat. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. She leaned the side of her body against his shin. It was a small thing. It was an enormous thing. He opened the box. The photograph was near the top. Caroline, at 31, in the courtyard of the church in Halifax where they had gotten married, turned slightly toward the camera, with the expression she always had when she was laughing at something he had just said but was trying not to show it. She was wearing her grandmother's earrings and holding her bouquet sideways because she had been gesturing when the photographer caught her, and she had always said that was the most honest photograph ever taken of her because she never held still long enough to pose. Terrence sat down on the floor. He had not planned to. His knees simply made the decision for him. He found the folded paper near the bottom of the box. Her handwriting, small and even, a list of things she was grateful for, written the week before she died. The way tea still holds my hand when we walk. The red maples in October. Good coffee. That ridiculous cat. The fact that a Tuesday can surprise you. He pressed his hand flat against the paper and his shoulders came forward once, then again, the way a structure gives way when something load-bearing finally admits it has been holding too much. He did not make a great noise. He had not cried loudly since he was a boy, but his face came down toward the paper, and his breath broke in a way that he had not allowed it to in 7 years, and Nell pressed herself against his side and stayed there, warm and steady and completely without agenda, while Pip slept on by the fire, unaware that anything in the world had changed. Terrence sat on the floor of the room he had not opened in 7 years, with his wife's handwriting in his hands, and a dog pressed quietly against him who had no idea why she was needed, and had come anyway. For the first time since Caroline died, he let himself stay in the room with it. He understood, sitting there in the cold dark with Nell's breathing against his side, that healing was not a thing that happened at a distance. You could not manage grief from another room. At some point, a door had to open, and sometimes, if you were fortunate, something patient and warm walked you to it first. March came to the Ottawa Valley the way it always came, unreliably, promising warmth and then pulling it back, the ground still frozen under snow that no longer looked fresh. The maples along Concession Road 9 stood bare-armed against a sky the color of old pewter, and the fields rolled away from the farmhouse in long pale stretches that would be mud before they were green. Inside, the farmhouse had stopped resembling a place where time was being carefully managed. There were paw prints on the porch boards, scratches on the mudroom baseboard, where Pip had once attempted to dig through a wall toward a sound he had heard outside, and been unreasonably committed to investigating. A collection of stolen objects under the living room couch, 1 work glove, 2 pen caps, a wooden spoon handle, and a length of Shusey's Terracins had stopped pretending to look for. Nell had her own modifications. The old blanket from the linen closet draped over the corner of the sofa where she slept, positioned so she could see both the front door and the hallway from the same spot. She had arranged this herself on the 3rd night, and Terrence had not moved it. Pip and Nell were roughly 4 months old now. Pip was broad and bright-eyed, with that mismatched gaze that made strangers stop and stare, his white chest and single white sock vivid against his black coat. He moved through life at approximately the speed of a minor emergency and had recently developed a theory about the compost bin that Terrence was dealing with one day at a time. Nell had grown more elegant, leaner and more deliberate in her movements, her white face with its brown shadows carrying a watchful intelligence that people found either calming or unnerving depending on the state of their conscience. She still checked rooms. She still chose her corners carefully. But she slept now without the constant low-current readiness she had carried in those first weeks. Sometimes in the evenings, when Terrence settled into the chair by the stove, Nell would walk over without ceremony and lie across his feet. She never climbed into his lap. She was not a dog who demanded. She simply arrived with a quiet authority that made the place where she rested feel, somehow, like where things were supposed to be. Helen Marsh started coming by more often, ostensibly for the dogs. Helen had never needed much of a pretext to show up, but she had learned over the years to offer one, because Terrence received social contact better when it arrived with a stated purpose. She brought dog biscuits and vegetable soup in equal measure and sat at the kitchen table drinking tea, while Pip attempted to climb her leg, and Nell watched her from across the room with the evaluating stillness of a border security agent. "She's sizing me up," Helen said, on her third visit. "She does that with everyone." "And what does she decide?" Terrence looked at Nell. "She's still deciding about me. I think she's just running a longer assessment on the rest of you." Helen laughed. She had a good laugh, the kind that suggested she had been using it for a long time. She looked around the kitchen. At the dish towel Pip had twice attempted to liberate, at the mud print on the floor near the back door, at the 2 water bowls, at the knitted blanket draped on the arm of the chair, and her expression was quiet and careful in a way that Terrence noticed and chose not to examine directly. "The house feels different," she said. "It's warmer." I adjusted the thermostat. Helen looked at him steadily. "You know what I mean," she said. He did. He poured more tea and did not answer, which with Helen had always been its own kind of answer. The event that changed things happened on a Saturday in mid-March, the kind of day that forgets it is still technically winter and offers an afternoon above zero as if apologizing for nothing. The snow pulled back from the south-facing field, enough to show a strip of frozen mud, and the light that came through the kitchen window had an angle to it that had been missing since November. Helen had mentioned the week before a gathering at the Carleton Place Legion, a small fundraiser for the shelter, June Alcott's organization, the same one where Terrence had spent 22 minutes fixing a furnace igniter and somehow acquired 2 dogs and a rearranged life. Helen had mentioned it the way she mentioned things she expected him to refuse, which was carefully and without looking directly at him. He had said no, initially. Then Nell had walked over, unhurried and deliberate, and placed one paw on top of his work boot. She looked up at him once, then away, as though she had registered her position and considered the matter settled. Pip immediately placed both paws on the other boot, because Pip's political philosophy was simple and total. Terrence had looked down at them and said very quietly, "This is not a democracy." Neither dog moved. He drove into Carleton Place on Saturday afternoon with both dogs in the back of the truck. Pip pressed his nose to the window glass and fogged it enthusiastically. Nell sat upright, ears forward, tracking the passing landscape with alert interest, but no distress. The Legion Hall smelled of coffee and old wood, and something fried that nobody was admitting to. Folding tables held donation jars and shelter brochures, and a raffle for a weekend at a bed and breakfast near Perth that had already sold through. A few dozen people moved through the room. Volunteers, locals, a handful of men and women in Legion jackets, some younger, some old enough to remember when the building was newer. Pip became a celebrity within 10 minutes. He found a child with a cookie, made prolonged eye contact, and waited with the patience of a trained negotiator until the child, overcome, shared half of it. The entire room witnessed this, and several people applauded. Pip accepted the applause as his due. Nell stayed close to Terrence at first, her dark shoulder brushing his leg, pale blue eye and brown eye scanning the room without alarm but without ease. Terrence kept his hand near her but not on her, available but not restraining. Then, near the window on the east wall, she stopped. A man sat alone in a folding chair set slightly apart from the nearest table. He was somewhere in his mid-80s, Terrence guessed, thin, wearing a plaid flannel shirt buttoned to the throat, with large hands folded in his lap and the particular stillness of someone who had learned that rooms move around you if you wait long enough. His name, Terrence would learn later, was Douglas Arnett. He had served with the Royal Canadian Regiment. He had 2 daughters who lived in different provinces and visited at Christmas. He came to Legion events because someone had once told him he should keep going places, and so he went and then sat near the window while the room moved around him in exactly the way he had predicted it would. Nell left Terrence's side without a command, without any signal Terrence could identify afterward. She crossed the room at a walk, not hurrying, not hesitating. She reached Douglas Arnett's chair and stopped, then lowered herself to the floor beside him, close enough that her shoulder touched his boot. The old man looked down. His hands, stiff with the kind of arthritis that bends fingers off true, came down slowly from his lap. He pressed one hand to the top of Nell's head. She closed her eyes. The room did not go silent, but it shifted. Conversations continued, but something in the texture of the gathering changed, a softening, as though everyone had unconsciously decided to speak a little quieter. Douglas Arnett's face moved. Something crossed it that was not sadness and was not quite happiness, but was the particular expression of a person remembering something they thought they had finished missing. "Steady, girl," he said. His voice was low. "You're all right." Terrence stood across the room with Pip's leash in one hand and understood that he was watching something he had no right to interrupt and perhaps no framework to fully describe. He had seen courage in operational settings, the loud kind, the documented kind. This was something else. This was the courage of a dog who had spent her first weeks of life learning that the world did not offer safety freely, choosing anyway to walk across a crowded room and offer it to someone who needed it more than she did. Helen appeared at his shoulder. She said nothing. She had the good sense to recognize moments that did not require improvement. June Alcott caught his eye from across the room and gave him a nod that contained a whole conversation inside it. Pip, having eaten half a donated cookie and made 3 new best friends, chose this moment to attempt to steal a pen from the raffle table, which restored the room's equilibrium and gave everyone something to laugh about. Terrence laughed too. It came out rougher than he expected, a sound that had not had much use, but it was real, and it moved through him like something long stopped starting again. Spring came to the Ottawa Valley the way it always eventually did, despite everything. Without asking, without announcement, the snow simply retreating one morning to reveal what had been underneath all along. The fields along Concession Road 9 went from white to brown to the particular uncertain green that is Canada's version of a tentative promise. Inside the farmhouse, the changes were everywhere and easier to read. 2 dog beds occupied the living room, though Nell rarely used hers and Pip used both. Muddy paw prints crossed the kitchen floor on any morning following rain, and Terrence had stopped mopping them immediately because the pattern of them, Pip's broad prints and Nell's narrower, precise ones, had begun to look to him like evidence of something valuable. There were scratches on the mudroom door and a dent in the baseboard, and a permanent wet dog smell that no amount of open windows fully addressed. A basket of toys near the wood stove. A leash hung on the peg by the door beside his jacket and work gloves, as though it had always been there. The back bedroom door stood open. Terrence had not made it into a monument. He had not wallpapered it with memory or turned the boxes into a museum. He had taken out the photograph and put it in a frame on the shelf in the living room, where the afternoon light caught it between 3 and 4 o'clock. He had read the folded paper 3 times, then folded it back and put it in the top drawer of his desk, where he could reach it without having to open a box. He had set a small jar of dried lavender on the kitchen windowsill, the kind you could buy at the farmer's market in Almonte, and he had not explained this to anyone and no one had asked. Pip and Nell were 5 months old now and no longer fragile. Pip was a sturdily built young dog with a coat that had settled into a deep, glinting black, and his white markings had sharpened, his mismatched eyes drawing attention from strangers wherever they went. He approached each day as a series of problems to be enthusiastically misidentified and solved incorrectly and celebrated anyway. A rabbit sighting was a diplomatic crisis. The compost bin remained an ongoing negotiation. Nell was leaner, more deliberate, and in possession of what Terrence could only describe as gravity. She was not a dog who performed. She was a dog who was simply, entirely present, and her presence had a quality to it that settled a room the way good weather settled a difficult crossing. She had learned to trust, not the trusting of a creature who had forgotten to be careful, but the trusting of one who had decided, with full knowledge of the risk, that this particular place and this particular person were worth it. In the evenings now, she did not stop near his knee and retreat. She came to him directly, turned once, and lay across his feet, with a sigh that sounded like the closing of something that had been long left open. Terrence had taken to sitting on the porch after supper when the weather allowed. There was a battered wooden bench along the west wall, where he had drunk his coffee alone for 2 years, and watched the field go through its seasons, and thought about a variety of things he usually managed not to think about, and sometimes did not. Helen had begun arriving some evenings with her own mug, and the slightly manufactured excuse of returning something she had borrowed. and she would sit at the other end of the bench, and they would watch the light go off the fields together without having to explain why they were there. It was on one of those evenings in April, the maples just beginning to bud along the fence line, that Terrence said what he had not said to anyone. Not all of it. Not the worst of it, which he kept in the way people keep certain things, not locked anymore, but not offered freely either, carried rather than displayed, but enough. He told Helen about the photograph at the top of the box, and how he had known it was there for 7 years, and had managed, through considerable effort, to leave it there. He told her about the folded paper and what Caroline had written on it, the red maples, the coffee, the cat, the fact that a Tuesday could still surprise you. He told her that he had not understood until recently what she had meant by that last one, that he had thought she was talking about good news arriving without warning, that he understood now she had been talking about being willing to be surprised at all. Helen held her mug in both hands and did not say anything for a long time. "She knew you," Helen said finally. "She always said you just needed the right door." Terrence looked out at the field. Nell was stretched on the porch boards beside his chair, one ear tipped toward the tree line, body easy and warm in the late light. Pip was attempting to catch a moth that had appeared from nowhere and was succeeding only in running into the porch railing at intervals, which he treated each time as an entirely new and unexpected obstacle. "She sent 2 dogs," Terrence said. He said it without planning to, and it surprised him a little. Helen looked at him. He looked at Pip, crashing into the railing again with a look of pure bewildered determination, and at Nell, still and watchful and close. He shook his head once, not dismissively, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had lived long enough to stop being entirely surprised by the things that saved him. "One to make me laugh," he said. "One to make me open the door." Helen's eyes were bright, but she was smiling rather than crying, which was the kind of emotional accuracy he had always respected in her. From inside, through the screen door, his phone buzzed on the kitchen table. Probably June Alcott, following up about the shelter's spring volunteer program, which Helen had submitted his name to without precisely asking him first. He would call her back. He would probably say yes. The math on these things he was learning was more complicated than it looked, and almost always worth attempting. Nell lifted her head from the porch boards and looked at him with her mismatched gaze. Shadow pale and dark brown, steady and unhurried and entirely without demand. He looked back at her. Across the field, the sun was laying itself down behind the tree line in long stripes of amber and rose, the same light that came every April to the Ottawa Valley, whether people were ready for it or not, indifferent to what the winter had been. Patient in the way that only very old things can afford to be patient. The maples threw their first shadows of the season across the frost-stopped ground, and somewhere in the maple bush a crow announced itself to no one in particular. Terrence Blythe had survived deployments and bureaucracy, and the particular silence that follows when someone who knew all your best jokes is no longer there to hear them. He had believed, for 7 years, that endurance was the highest form of faithfulness. To Caroline's memory, to the life they had built, to the discipline of a man who did not require comfort to keep going. He understood now, in the clear, unhurried light of an April evening in eastern Ontario, that she would have found that idea both touching and completely wrong. You didn't honor love by surviving it from a distance. You honored it by remaining available to it, by keeping the door cracked, by not turning away the next thing that pressed its face against the gate and looked at you like it already knew who you were. He reached down and put his hand on Nell's head. She did not move, except to close her eyes. The porch held them. The man, the lunatic dog still pursuing his moth, and the quiet dog who had walked across a crowded room and chosen, deliberately and without instruction, to lie down beside an old soldier's grief and stay. Below the farmhouse, the fields of Concession Road 9 went green and gold in the April light, and the Ottawa Valley, unhurried and enormous and old beyond reckoning, continued its long, patient work of turning winter into something you hadn't dared to hope for yet.